Have you ever wondered about how many brilliant leaders were forgotten in the history books? While we all know about famous generals like George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant, there are others whose names we should know, but don't. Imagine leading armies to victory and changing the course of history only for your name to be erased, leaving almost no trace behind. This is the story of Justin Andress, the most influential army leader you've never heard of, who was written out of US history. Let's dive into why his name deserves to be remembered. When we talk about great military leaders in US history, names like George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight D. Eisenhower are the first to come up. These men are celebrated for their roles in shaping the nation's military successes. But for every famous name, there are dozens of lesser-known figures whose contributions are just as important, if not more so. These unsung heroes made crucial decisions, led men into battle, and changed the outcome of wars. Justin Andress is one such leader, someone whose influence was undeniable, yet his name never made it into the history books. So why have we never heard of Justin Andress? The answer lies not in his lack of talent, but in the politics and rivalries of his time. His story is a cautionary tale of how history can be shaped not only by those who make it, but also by those who write it. In Andress's case, powerful people chose to erase his name, despite his role in winning some of the most important battles of the 19th century. Justin Andress didn't come from a wealthy or influential family. He was born in a small town in the early 19th century and grew up in a modest household. From a young age, Andress was fascinated by strategy and leadership. He spent hours reading about famous battles and military tactics, preparing himself for the day when he would get the chance to prove his own abilities. When Andress joined the US Army during the Mexican-American War, he quickly stood out. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it meant challenging higher-ranking officers. He had a sharp eye for strategy and an ability to see opportunities where others only saw chaos. Andress wasn't the one to blindly follow orders if he thought there was a better way to do things, and that often put him at odds with his superiors. Despite his unorthodox methods, Andress quickly rose through the ranks. His ability to lead men in battle and his knack for outsmarting the enemy earned him respect from his fellow soldiers, though not always from the top brass. His biggest challenge, however, wasn't the enemy. It was the internal politics of the US Army. Andress didn't play the political game, and it cost him. By the time the Civil War began, Andress was ready to prove his worth on a larger stage. He was stationed with the Union Army, and while many of his peers were focused on promotions and titles, Andress was focused on one thing: winning. And yet, as he rose in prominence, powerful people within the army saw him as a threat. His unconventional ways made him enemies, and these enemies were determined to sideline him. Andress's defining moment came during the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, a two-day engagement that would go down as one of the bloodiest and most pivotal clashes of the Civil War. The battle was chaotic from the start. Union forces, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, were caught completely off guard by a surprise Confederate attack at dawn. The Confederate Army, led by Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, launched a ferocious assault on the Union encampment near Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. As Confederate troops advanced, they quickly overwhelmed the Union forces, who were poorly positioned and unprepared for such a large-scale attack. The Union lines began to crumble under the pressure, and confusion spread through the ranks. Soldiers, many of whom were new to battle, panicked as artillery shells exploded and musket fire filled the air. The Confederate Army seemed poised to deliver a crushing blow that could potentially end Grant's campaign in the Western Theater. As hours passed, it became clear that the Union Army was teetering on the brink of total collapse. Most of the Union generals were scrambling to hold their positions, unsure of how to counter the unexpected onslaught. This was the chaotic situation that Justin Andress found himself in. Unlike many of his fellow officers, Andres wasn't rattled by the chaos unfolding around him. As he observed the battlefield, he noticed something critical that others seemed to overlook. While most of the Union commanders were focused on desperately trying to defend their ground, Andres saw a gap forming in the Confederate lines. He realized that the Confederate forces were overextended and vulnerable in certain places, particularly on their left flank. Andres proposed a bold and unorthodox plan that involved a counterattack rather than a continued defensive posture. He suggested pulling back some Union forces and sending them around to flank the Confederates from the side, taking advantage of their thinly stretched lines. His idea was to launch a surprise assault on the Confederate left, exploiting their weakened position and turning the momentum of the battle in the Union's favor. It was a risky move, one that few were willing to endorse at the time. After all, the Union Army was on the verge of defeat, and most commanders were focused on regrouping rather than launching counteroffensives. But Andres believed that the key to victory lay in taking the fight to the enemy, rather than waiting for the Confederates to tighten their stranglehold. He was confident that a well-executed flanking maneuver could throw the Confederate forces into disarray, even as they seemed to be on the brink of victory. Despite initial skepticism, Andres's plan was eventually given the green light, partly due to the desperation of the situation. Union forces under Andres's direction quickly moved to execute the maneuver. They swung around to the Confederate left, taking the enemy by surprise. The Confederates, who had been pressing their advantage, were caught off guard by the sudden and aggressive counterattack. The flanking maneuver was executed with near-perfect precision. The Confederate forces, who had been focusing on breaking through the Union center, were now being attacked from an unexpected direction. Confusion spread through their ranks as they scrambled to respond. The momentum of the battle shifted dramatically, and what had once seemed like a sure Confederate victory began to unravel. Thanks to Andres's tactical brilliance, the Union forces were able to turn the tide at Shiloh. While the battle itself would end in a costly draw, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, Andres's flanking maneuver prevented what could have been a catastrophic defeat for the Union. Many historians argue that his decision was crucial in allowing the Union Army to regroup and hold their ground, ultimately preserving their strength for future battles in the Western theater. Yet, despite the success of his plan, Andres's contribution to the victory at Shiloh went largely unnoticed. Official reports credited higher-ranking generals for the eventual outcome, and Andres's role was downplayed. Despite his pivotal role at Shiloh, Andres's career began to decline after the battle. His enemies within the army, jealous of his success and wary of his influence, worked behind the scenes to ensure that he wouldn't rise any higher. He was passed over for promotions, and his achievements were quietly erased from official records. As the Civil War continued, Andres found himself increasingly sidelined. His once prominent role in the Union Army diminished, and he was assigned to less important duties. Despite his proven abilities on the battlefield, the political forces within the army were determined to keep him out of the spotlight. Andres continued to serve with distinction, but his contributions were ignored. When Andres returned home after the war, the reality of being written out of history slowly began to sink in. While other generals were being honored with parades and monuments, Andres lived a quiet and humble life, far away from the spotlight. It wasn't that he sought fame or recognition, he had always been more interested in serving his country. But to see others bask in the glory of victories he had shaped left a bitter taste. As years passed, Andres attempted to clear his name and set the record straight, but he was up against a system that had already decided his fate. His efforts to publish his own accounts of the war were met with resistance. Publishers were hesitant to take on a narrative that contradicted the official story. His letters to influential figures within the government and military were ignored or dismissed. It seemed that the more he tried to reclaim his place in history, the more those in power sought to bury him deeper. One of the few surviving accounts of Andres's contributions came from soldiers who had served under him. Many of them spoke about his leadership, recalling the calm and confidence he exuded even in the most dire situations. These testimonials, though never formally published, were passed down through generations, preserving the memory of a man who had been crucial to their victories. Despite the obstacles he faced, Justin Andres never lost his commitment to service. Even in obscurity, his legacy of determination, courage, and brilliance lived on through the men he led and the battles he helped win. But just because history forgot Justin Andres doesn't mean we have to. His story deserves to be told, not only as a tribute to his contributions, but also as a cautionary tale of how history can be manipulated. Andres was a brilliant leader whose strategies saved countless lives and helped secure Union victories, even if his name is absent from the pages of history. It's time to remember the forgotten heroes like Andres, whose contributions have been overshadowed by politics and power plays. His impact on U.S. military history is undeniable, and his story deserves to be restored to its rightful place. So what do you think? Does Justin Andres deserve more recognition in U.S. history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more about forgotten figures in history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories.